My name is Sloan Merritt. I am 29 years old. And the Saturday afternoon, my brother stood at a birthday lunch in a restored inn in Asheville and told 14 members of my family that I had always been a liability. Was the afternoon I finally understood that a reputation built on repetition is only as solid as the first person willing to contradict it out loud. He did not frame it as an attack. That was the part one had spent years not knowing how to explain to people who hadn't witnessed it. He framed it as concern. He picked up his water glass, turned to address the table at a conversational angle, and said, in the measured tone he used when he wanted to sound reluctant, "I just think, given everything, that Graham should have someone reliable handling her affairs going forward. Sloan has been a liability to this family for years. I don't think anyone here would dispute that." My Aunt Patricia laughed. Not a cruel laugh, more the laugh of someone relieved that someone else had said the thing they had been thinking. My mother looked at the tablecloth. I folded my napkin into thirds and set it beside my plate and kept my eyes on the centerpiece, which was a low arrangement of burgundy dahlias in a cream ceramic bowl, and I did not stand up and I did not speak. What no one at that table had noticed, because he was at the far end, and because the lunch had moved into the comfortable noise of 14 people talking, and because he had the particular quality of stillness that certain people develop over long careers of watching other people, was that the man seated beside my grandmother's closest friend had not put away the pale green folder that had been sitting beside his bread plate since before the first course arrived. His name was Dr. Reuben Castile. He was my grandmother's internist. He had been her physician for 11 years. And the folder he was holding contained an 18-month clinical summary that my brother had never known existed, because my brother had not been the one managing my grandmother's medical care. I had been. I want to tell you about my grandmother before I tell you about my brother, because understanding what she meant to me is the only way to understand why I had spent 3 years doing what I did without telling anyone I was doing it. My grandmother's name is Eleanor Merritt. She turned 80 on the 23rd of September, and she is the kind of person who fills a room not by commanding it but by being so fully herself within it that the room simply arranges itself around her. She taught high school English for 31 years in Asheville. She can recite the entirety of 4 Shakespeare sonnets and the first act of Hamlet from memory, and does so at intervals that suggest she is doing it for her own enjoyment rather than anyone else's. She makes the best biscuits I have ever eaten in my life, and when I once asked her for the recipe, she told me the recipe was in the hands and not in the ingredients, which is the kind of answer that is both unhelpful and completely true. When my grandfather died 11 years ago, Eleanor did what practical women of her generation often do. She adjusted. She sold the large house, moved into a smaller one 3 miles away, joined 2 book clubs, and began spending more time with the grandchildren who made the effort to show up. I was 22 when my grandfather died. I showed up. Not in a strategic way. I was not thinking about inheritance or positioning or any of the architecture that I would only understand later had been under construction in my brother's mind for years. I showed up because my grandmother was someone I wanted to be near, and because the alternative, drifting into the comfortable distance of someone who called on holidays and visited twice a year, seemed like a form of loss I could prevent. My brother, whose name is Owen and who is 4 years older than me and has lived in Charlotte since his mid-20s, made the alternative choice. This is not a criticism. Charlotte is 5 hours from Asheville. He had a career that demanded travel, a marriage that produced 2 children in quick succession, and a life structured around a different city's geography. The visits became the twice-yearly kind. The calls became the holiday kind. This is how families disperse, and it is not a moral failing. What became a moral failing was something different, and it happened gradually enough that I did not recognize it as a pattern until it had already organized itself into a structure. I am a hospital administrator. I have worked in healthcare operations for 6 years, the last 3 of them as a department operations manager at a regional medical center in Asheville. I manage staffing, compliance, patient flow coordination, and the specific and relentless administrative machinery that keeps a mid-sized hospital department functioning without visible seams. It is not glamorous work. It is extraordinarily detailed work, and it requires the ability to hold a large number of moving variables in a stable configuration under conditions that are frequently chaotic. I mention this because my professional competence and the story of what my brother called my instability are not separate subjects. They are the same subject, viewed from opposite ends. Owen's characterization of me as unstable had a specific origin point, which I can date with reasonable precision to the autumn of the year I turned 24. I had, that year, left a relationship that had lasted 3 years and moved back to Asheville from Raleigh, where I had been working for a hospital network that I left because the relationship's end and the job's location were entangled in ways that made staying feel like a form of self-punishment. I moved into a sublet near downtown Asheville. I found a new position within 6 weeks. I was functional, employed, and making a considered geographical and professional reset. Owen characterized it, at a Christmas gathering that year, as a breakdown. I heard this not from him directly, but from my cousin Diane, who mentioned it with the careful phrasing of someone trying to be helpful while also being a little interested in the drama. He had apparently told our Aunt Patricia that I had fallen apart and come running home, and that he was worried about her stability going forward. I do not know exactly what words he used. I know the shape they made in the room because I could feel it when I arrived at Christmas, the particular calibration of concern that is indistinguishable from condescension if you are the subject of it. I did not confront him about it. This was a decision I have examined many times and I do not regret it, though I understand why people think I should have. My reasoning was simple. The facts of my life would either become visible or they would not, and arguing with Owen about his characterization of them was a fight that would cost me energy I needed for the actual work of building the thing he had already declared ruined. So I built it quietly. I took the position at the Regional Medical Center. I was promoted once at 18 months and again at 3 years. I managed a department of 41 people. I received, 2 years running, the facility's Internal Operations Excellence Recognition, which is not an award that appears on a press release, but which is the kind of institutional acknowledgement that people who work in healthcare understand the significance of. I did this without mentioning it to Owen, not because I was concealing it, but because we did not have the kind of relationship in which I reported my professional benchmarks to him. And I helped my grandmother. Eleanor's health had begun its first significant transition about 4 years before the birthday lunch. Nothing dramatic, the slow erosion of certain capacities that accompanies the late 70s, the need for more frequent medical appointments, the gradual complexity of a pharmaceutical regimen that had grown to include 4 daily medications and 2 as-needed ones. She was not diminished. She was simply, for the first time in her life, in need of consistent logistical support. I became that support because I was in Asheville and I had the competence to navigate medical systems, and because she asked me, in the direct and unornamental way she asked for things, if I would come with her to her next cardiology appointment. I went. I took notes. I asked the follow-up questions that she sometimes forgot to ask. I coordinated with Dr. Castile's office when the medication regimen needed adjustment. I kept a folder, the pale green one, which I had started as a personal organizational tool and which had grown over 18 months into a comprehensive clinical summary that Dr. Castile had eventually asked me to bring to appointments because it was more complete than his own intake records. He had said this once, in the examining room, while my grandmother was putting her cardigan back on. He had looked at the folder and then at me and said, "You're in healthcare." It was not a question. I said yes. He said, "It shows." And that was the entire conversation, which is the kind of exchange that people who work in medical settings have, brief, specific, and carrying more weight than its word count suggests. Owen did not know about the folder. He did not know about the appointments or the medication coordination or the 3 occasions on which I had navigated Eleanor through a process that required someone who understood how insurance authorization works and how to move a specialist referral through a system that defaults to delay. He did not know because he had not asked, and I had not told him, and my grandmother, who had her own sense of what information required sharing and what did not, had mentioned my help to him exactly once, in a phone call he had apparently received as general family update information rather than as a specific and significant fact. What Owen knew was the story he had told himself since I was 24, that I was the unstable one, the one who had come home from a failed relationship in a failed city, the one who needed managing. He had told the story for 5 years. It had become, in the way of stories told often enough, simply true to everyone who had heard it enough times. The birthday lunch had been Eleanor's idea, in the specific way that Eleanor's ideas tended to be, announced as settled arrangements rather than proposals. She had chosen the Inn herself, a restored 1890s property in the River Arts District that did a weekend brunch service she had tried twice before and wanted to revisit, and she had organized the guest list, which ran to 14 plus herself. Owen and his wife had driven up from Charlotte the previous evening. My Aunt Patricia and her husband had come from Hendersonville. The other guests were a mixture of Eleanor's contemporaries, 2 book club members, a former colleague, a neighbor of 30 years, and the younger family members who had maintained consistent presence. Dr. Castile had been invited by Eleanor herself. This was not unusual. She had a habit of including people from different categories of her life in the same gathering, on the grounds that compartmentalization was a waste of everyone's time. He had attended her 75th birthday in a similar configuration. He arrived that Saturday with a colleague's retirement gift card he needed to mail and the pale green folder, which he had brought because Eleanor had mentioned at her last appointment that she wanted to discuss her spring medication review at the lunch in a quiet moment, and he had said he would bring the summary so they could refer to it. He was seated at the far end of the table, between Eleanor's neighbor Margaret and the book club member whose name I always confused with someone else's. He had a glass of iced tea. He had set the folder beside his bread plate. He had been listening with the particular quality of attention that physicians develop in rooms where patients describe their own histories to the lunch conversation. I know all of this because he told me afterward. He said he had arrived in the middle of the conversation about what my brother was calling Graham's arrangements going forward, and had registered it as a family discussion he was adjacent to, but not part of. And then Owen had said what he said, and Dr. Castile had looked at me, at the way I folded the napkin and set it down and kept my eyes on the dahlias, and had made a decision. Owen finished what he was saying. He had several additional sentences after the liability remark, which I will not reconstruct in full because they were variations on the same point, that my grandmother's affairs required someone organized, someone reliable, someone without my history of instability, and that he was prepared to step in and provide that. His wife nodded at appropriate intervals. My Aunt Patricia made a sound that was not quite agreement, but adjacent to it. My grandmother looked at me from her end of the table. She had the expression she used when she was deciding whether to speak immediately or wait, which I had learned to read over 29 years. She waited. Dr. Castile set down his iced tea. He did not stand. He did not raise his voice. He said, in the conversational register of someone making a factual observation, I hope you'll forgive me for saying something, since this seems to be a discussion about Eleanor's medical care and I'm her physician. The table adjusted. Owen turned. I've been Eleanor's internist for 11 years, Dr. Castile said. For the past 18 months, Sloan has attended every significant appointment, coordinated all medication adjustments, managed 2 specialist referrals, and maintained a clinical summary of Eleanor's care that is more thorough than most professional care coordinators produce. I have it here. He touched the pale green folder. I brought it today because Eleanor asked me to so we could discuss her spring review. He opened the folder to the typed header page. He did not read from it. He simply held it open for a moment so the header was visible to the people nearest him, then closed it again and set it back beside his bread plate. I'm not in a position to speak to family dynamics, he said, but I can speak to what I've observed professionally. What I've observed is someone who manages complexity under pressure, asks the right questions, and follows through consistently. That is what Eleanor's care has required, and that is what it has received. He picked up his iced tea again. The table was quiet in the particular way of rooms where something has been said that cannot be unsaid, and no one has yet decided what to do with it. Owen said, this isn't about her medical. No, Eleanor said. Her voice was not loud. It had the quality of a period at the end of a sentence. Owen looked at her. Let's have the next course, she said. And that was the end of it in the room. The server arrived with the soup. Conversation resumed in the slightly recalibrated register of 14 people who had all just absorbed the same new information and were processing it privately. My Aunt Patricia did not say anything for the remainder of the lunch. Owen ate his soup. I ate mine. It was a roasted butternut squash with a creme fraiche swirl, and it was very good. I want to be precise about what happened in the hours and days after that lunch, because the consequence cascade that followed was not something I had arranged. It was something Owen had been building for years, and Dr. Castile's 4 sentences simply clarified what it was made of. Owen had, in the months before the birthday lunch, begun a quiet campaign to have himself named as Eleanor's healthcare proxy. He had sent her 2 letters, formal ones, typewritten, which Eleanor had mentioned to me with the specific dryness she used for things she found both presumptuous and faintly impressive in their ambition. He had called her twice to discuss planning. He had reached out to her state attorney, a woman named Harriet Bowl, who had managed Eleanor's documents for 15 years, to inquire about updating Eleanor's advance directive. Harriet Bowl, to her credit, had noted the inquiry and mentioned it to Eleanor at their next meeting, which is the appropriate professional response. Eleanor had told her to make no changes without a direct instruction from Eleanor herself, and had done so, and had not told Owen that she had done so. What Eleanor did tell Owen, in a phone call 3 weeks after the birthday lunch, was that she had completed a formal healthcare proxy designation. She named me. She had done this, according to Harriet, 6 months before the birthday lunch, a fact that Owen had not known, could not have known, and which arrived as information rather than as anything I had engineered. Eleanor had made her own assessment of who had been present and what that presence had required, and she had acted on that assessment with the unhurried efficiency she brought to every practical matter. Owen called me after that phone call with Eleanor. He said, "She told me." I said, "I know." He said, "Were you ever going to tell me you were doing all of this? The appointments, I said, "It didn't occur to me that I needed to report it to you. Graham needed help. I helped." A pause. I could hear traffic through his end of the call. He was in a parking lot somewhere, I think, the specific acoustic of a car door recently closed. He said, "The doctor." I said, "Dr. Castile. He's been her physician for 11 years. He was at the birthday lunch because Graham invited him." Another pause. "You didn't arrange that," Owen said. It was not quite a question. "No," I said. "He brought a folder because Graham asked him to. He said what he said because it was accurate and because he's someone who says accurate things when they become relevant." Owen was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had a quality I had not heard from him in years. Not apologetic, exactly, but recalibrated. The voice of someone who has updated a model and is still adjusting to the new version. He said, "I've been telling people the wrong story about you." I said, "Yes." He said, "For a long time." I said, "Yes." I let that sit. There was no productive addition to it, and I have learned, slowly and with considerable practice, to let true things sit without elaboration. He said, "I don't know how to fix that." I said, "You could start by not continuing to tell it." He said, "Okay." That was the end of that call. It was 6 minutes and some seconds. I did not feel anything dramatic when I hung up. I felt the specific release of a thing that had been held in tension for a long time and had finally been set down, which is a physical sensation more than an emotional one, a loosening in the upper back and shoulders. The practical aftermath unfolded over the following months in ways that were largely administrative, which is the form that most genuine consequences take. Owen's inquiry to Harriet Bowl about Eleanor's advance directive was on record. Harriet had noted it with dates and the specific nature of the inquiry. When Eleanor completed the healthcare proxy designation, Harriet included a notation in the file that documented the sequence, the prior inquiry, Eleanor's explicit instruction that no changes be made without her direct order, and the subsequent designation. This notation was not punitive. It was simply accurate record-keeping, which is what Harriet did. It meant that the document trail told the story of who had been trying to manage Eleanor's affairs without her direction, and who had been managing them with it. Owen did not contest the proxy designation. He had no grounds to, and I believe, to his credit, which I am willing to extend, that he understood he had no grounds to. He withdrew from the project of positioning himself around Eleanor's estate in the way that someone withdraws from something when they understand it has been observed. He and his wife came to Asheville for Christmas that year. It was the first Christmas in 4 years that Owen had made the drive rather than having Eleanor drive to Charlotte, which she had been doing, because he said the drive was easier for her. Eleanor, who had been making the 5-hour drive to Charlotte cheerfully and without complaint, had never disputed this characterization because she was the kind of person who did not spend energy correcting small false premises when larger true things were available to attend to. At Christmas, Owen helped Eleanor carry things from the car. He asked me, privately, in the kitchen while we were doing dishes, whether I thought Graham was managing well. He asked it as a genuine question rather than as a frame for whatever he wanted to say next, which was different from the way he had previously asked similar questions. I told him what I actually knew. The medications were stable. The last cardiology review had been positive. She had mentioned some fatigue that Dr. Castile was monitoring, and she was on a waiting list for a particular book club that had a 6-month queue, which she found simultaneously irritating and appropriate. Owen listened. He said, "Thank you for doing all of this." I said, "It isn't a favor. She's my grandmother." He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "I mean, I know that now." I handed him a dish to dry. He dried it. We did the dishes, and it was not a moment of resolution so much as a moment of two people standing in a kitchen doing a task that needed doing, which is, in my experience, how most real things between people begin to shift, not in speeches but in shared work and the willingness to show up for it. Eleanor turned 80 in September. By the following April, she had completed a full estate review with Harriet Bowl, updated her documents to reflect her current wishes, and made a specific and characteristically direct decision to gift me, while she was living, the sum of $48,000 from her investment account, a figure she had calculated with the precision she brought to financial matters, as the approximate value of the coordination and administrative work I had provided over the preceding 4 years, priced at a professional rate she had found online and printed out and shown me across her kitchen table with an expression that indicated she considered the matter settled. I told her it wasn't necessary. She told me she hadn't asked whether it was necessary. I accepted it. It is in a savings account. I have not spent it. I am not entirely sure what I will do with it, which is a problem I have decided I am allowed to solve slowly. Dr. Castile retired from his practice the following spring. Eleanor sent him a bonsai fig tree because she had noticed one in his office and remembered. He sent back a card that said, in his characteristically economical handwriting, 11 years. It was a privilege. Eleanor put the card on her refrigerator, where it remains between a postcard from the Blue Ridge Parkway and a photograph of her book club from 2019. I see Eleanor on Sundays when I can. She is still making biscuits. She still recites Shakespeare at intervals that suggest she is doing it for herself. Last month, she started a new book club. The waiting list turned out to be 8 months, not 6, which she described as typical of anything worth waiting for. And she is reading, currently, a novel she has characterized as extremely long and entirely worth it, which I take as her general operating standard for most things. Owen calls me occasionally now. Not often, we are not, and are unlikely to become, the kind of siblings who speak weekly. But occasionally. He called last Tuesday to ask whether I thought Eleanor would want a particular birthday gift he was considering, and I told him honestly what I thought, and he said thanks, and the call was 6 minutes and unremarkable, and I felt, when I hung up, that this was probably the shape of what we were going to be, which is enough. The person who tells the room who you are has already lost the argument to anyone who has actually read the file. That is what I know now. My brother told 14 people at a birthday lunch that I was a liability, and the physician at the far end of the table had spent 18 months reading the file that said otherwise, and when those two things occupied the same room at the same time, the story that one was not the one told loudest or longest. It was the one attached to documentation. I did not plan Dr. Castile's presence at that lunch. I did not orchestrate what he said. I had spent 3 years doing a job that needed doing, in the presence of a professional who was paying attention, and when the moment arrived in which attention became relevant, he was simply there with a folder because my grandmother had asked him to bring it. That is all it was. I showed up consistently enough that the record of my showing up existed, and was present in the room on the day someone tried to say I never had. My grandmother asked me, a few weeks after the birthday lunch, whether I was all right. I told her I was. She said, "Good," and handed me a bowl of snap peas to shell, which is her version of therapeutic engagement and also more effective than most alternatives. We shelled the peas. She told me about the novel she was reading. I told her about a staffing challenge at the hospital. Outside her kitchen window, the last of the September light was going orange over the hills, and the cat she has had for 6 years was sleeping on the sill in the specific and total way that cats sleep, and it was a very ordinary afternoon. I have thought about that afternoon more than I have thought about the birthday lunch, which seems like the correct proportion. Before I go, I want to ask you something. At that birthday lunch in Asheville, 14 people heard Dr. Ruben Castile open a pale green folder and read 4 sentences that reframed everything my brother had spent 5 years telling this family about me. After the lunch ended and people were collecting their coats and saying their goodbyes, 3 of those 14 people found a moment to speak to me. My grandmother's neighbor Margaret squeezed my arm. My cousin Diane said quietly, "I should have said something sooner." My grandmother herself said nothing to me directly. She talked with Dr. Castile about her spring medication review for about 10 minutes, efficiently and specifically, and then came and stood beside me and we watched Owen help his wife into her coat, and she said, "You make very good snap peas," which is not about peas. Here's what I want to ask you. The 11 people who said nothing, not then, not in the days after, do you think that silence was indifference? Or do you think some of them were doing something else, something harder to name? I'm genuinely curious what you think. Leave it in the comments. I read them. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. There's a new story every week, and I try to make each one worth your time. Thank you for being here.